Two powerful figures, Cleric Ali Khamenei and General Reza Asghar, were secretly at the center of a plot that would not only shake Iran to its core, but could ignite a global conflict. When a series of brutal murders of high-ranking clerics linked to Iran's most sensitive military projects sends shockwaves through the nation, no one could have predicted that these two men would be at the heart of a conspiracy so dangerous that it would put the entire Muslim world on the brink of war. As the truth behind the killings begins to unravel, so does the terrifying plan to provoke the United States, one that could alter the course of history forever. The holy city of Qom, often regarded as the heart of Iran's religious establishment, was rocked by a series of brutal murders that no one could have predicted. Known for its centuries-old religious significance, Qom is a place where scholars, students and pilgrims come to deepen their understanding of Islam. It was here, amid the sacred halls of the seminary and the quiet prayer spaces, that the first body was discovered. An elderly cleric, his life violently taken in a manner that seemed almost ritualistic. The scene was eerily calm, with no sign of struggle, just the lifeless body of a man who had long been a respected figure within the religious community. At first, authorities thought little of the death. After all, the region had seen occasional violence in the past, political dissidents, extremists with their own agendas. But this was different. This was something far more calculated. A day later, another cleric was found murdered under similarly unsettling circumstances. His body was positioned in a strange pose, surrounded by cryptic symbols etched into the floor. Investigators were baffled. The brutality of the crime didn't fit the profile of typical political killings, nor did it resemble any gang-related violence. This was more deliberate, almost staged. As the days passed, more victims surfaced. All of them were high-ranking clerics with connections to military secrets, individuals who had direct involvement in Iran's complex defense operations. Their deaths raised immediate concerns. Were these murders part of a political power struggle within Iran's religious and military elite? Or were they the work of foreign agents looking to destabilize the country? The more investigators delved into the cases, the more they realized the pattern wasn't random. It seemed like the killings were intricately planned, almost like a message being sent, though to whom, no one could say. With each new crime scene, the same eerie details appeared. The bodies, the symbols, and most perplexing of all, the flash drives. Small, encrypted and hidden carefully at each scene, they promised a trail that would lead down an even darker path, one that no one could have predicted. As investigators began to piece together the details of the murders, a chilling realization slowly took shape. The deaths were not just random acts of violence, nor were they part of some spontaneous uprising. There was a pattern, an unsettling one that hinted at something much larger. Each victim had been killed with precision, their bodies arranged in ways that seemed almost deliberate, as though the murders were designed to send a message rather than simply end lives. The eerie symbols drawn near the bodies weren't just the random scribblings of a killer. They were carefully crafted, designed to convey meaning, though no one could decipher them at first glance. But what stood out most in the initial investigation were the encrypted flash drives found hidden at every crime scene. These tiny, inconspicuous devices were buried beneath the bodies or carefully concealed within their clothing. Initially, investigators thought they were merely pieces of evidence left behind by the killer, maybe stolen files or records of some criminal activity. But the nature of these flash drives, their encrypted contents, quickly raised alarms. What could they contain? What information were these clerics hiding that someone might want to wipe out an entire group of powerful figures? To protect, the task of decrypting the files fell into the hands of a small group of experts, intelligence officers and cryptographers who had experience working with highly classified government data. What they uncovered was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The files weren't filled with religious texts or documents about local politics as some had assumed. Instead, they contained highly sensitive military information, detailed schematics for missile systems, data on weapons development, and references to covert operations that were unknown to the public. The most chilling discovery came in the form of a plan, an intricate blueprint outlining a potential false flag operation aimed at provoking the United States into striking Iran. The document suggested that a staged attack, one designed to look like an act of aggression from a foreign power, could be used to rally domestic support and justify military retaliation. This was no ordinary political maneuver. It was a calculated attempt to ignite a conflict on a global scale. As the investigators pieced the puzzle together, it became clear that the murders were just the tip of a much darker iceberg, and the true scope of the conspiracy was far beyond what anyone had expected. As the encrypted flash drives were decrypted, the gravity of the discovery began to sink in. The information contained within them revealed a side of Iran's military operations that was shrouded in secrecy. While the world knew about Iran's missile programs and its role in the region, the documents revealed something far more chilling. A deep, covert network of military elites working in the shadows, with plans to manipulate global events for their own purposes. These weren't just military strategists or engineers. They were clerics, high-ranking religious figures who had close ties to the Iranian government and its armed forces. Their dual role as both spiritual leaders and military advisors made them incredibly influential, their deaths now appearing to target something more significant than just a religious agenda. The files revealed blueprints for advanced missile systems, designs that were far more sophisticated than anything publicly known. The plans were a testament to Iran's military ambitions. But the more disturbing discovery was how these missile systems were intended to be used. The document suggested that these weapons weren't meant to be deployed as part of a standard defense strategy, but as a means of escalating a global conflict. It became clear that the clerics had been involved in far more than religious matters. They were directly tied to Iran's most sensitive military projects. But it wasn't just about missiles. The real shock came from a document buried deep in the files, one that described a chilling plan for a false flag operation. The plan detailed a series of staged events, carefully constructed to look like an attack from a foreign power, likely the United States, that would provoke an immediate military response from the U.S. government. The goal was to create the conditions for war, not to defend Iran, but to force an international conflict that would shift the balance of power in the Middle East and beyond. The false flag operation wasn't just a theoretical scenario. The plan included detailed strategies for execution. How to fabricate evidence, manipulate the media, and manufacture public outrage. It was a deliberate Machiavellian scheme designed to trick the world into believing that Iran had been wronged, pushing the U.S. into a war that would provide the perfect cover for a new phase of military and political maneuvering. What the clerics had been working on was not just a missile project. It was a terrifying geopolitical strategy that could alter the future of the region. But as the investigators delved deeper, they realized that this plan, if successful, could change the world as we know it. As the full scope of the encrypted files emerged, it became increasingly clear that the murder of the clerics was no random act of violence, but rather the result of a deliberate, calculated move in a high-stakes political game. The more investigators uncovered, the more they realized that the deaths were only a small part of a much larger conspiracy, one that stretched deep into the heart of Iran's military and religious elite. These were not just killings driven by power struggles within the government or rival factions. These were deaths designed to protect something far more valuable, a secret military project that, if revealed, could have disastrous consequences for both Iran and the world. The clerics' involvement in the missile program was no longer a mere suspicion. It was a hard truth backed by irrefutable evidence in the form of classified documents. These men, revered for their religious standing, had been working on developing weapons that could shift the power balance of the region. Their work, tied directly to the military's most secretive divisions, included blueprints for missile systems capable of reaching far beyond Iran's borders. The idea was not just to develop advanced weapons, but to possess the kind of military capability that would allow Iran to stand toe-to-toe with global superpowers, particularly the United States. However, it wasn't just the technology itself that had triggered such violence. What shook the investigators to their core was the realization that the clerics had been involved in a scheme that went far beyond military strategy. They were part of a grand plan to manipulate global geopolitics. The false flag operation they had been orchestrating was designed not just to provoke a military response from the U.S., but to control the narrative and sway public opinion on an international scale. The plan was terrifying in its complexity. It wasn't simply about triggering a war. It was about creating an environment in which Iran could manipulate global powers to its advantage. The aim was to fabricate a crisis so convincing, so well documented, that the world would have no choice but to respond. Iran would emerge not just as a nation defending itself, but as a victim of international aggression. In the chaos that would follow, the clerics believed they could seize control of the narrative, destabilize the region, and alter the power dynamics of the entire Muslim world. As investigators dug deeper into the plan, it became clear that the clerics had gone to great lengths to ensure its success. They had left nothing to chance. Every detail was accounted for, every possible outcome anticipated. But as the web of deception unraveled, the question remained: who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and why had these clerics been killed, if not to protect the secrecy of this operation? The answers were elusive, but one thing was certain: the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. As the investigation into the murders of the clerics deepened, the Iranian government found itself in a perilous position. The shocking revelations contained in the decrypted files had exposed a level of secrecy and military ambition that few had even imagined. The clerics, long thought to be spiritual leaders, had been secretly orchestrating one of the most dangerous geopolitical strategies in Iran's history. The documents painted a picture of men who had not only been developing advanced missile systems, but had been actively plotting a false flag operation to provoke a war with the United States. The plan was audacious, and the potential consequences of it becoming public were catastrophic. Faced with the overwhelming pressure of these revelations, the Iranian government knew it had to act quickly. The country was on the verge of chaos, as both internal factions and external forces scrambled to understand what had really been going on. The clerics' deaths, which were initially seen as the result of a possible power struggle within the religious elite, now appeared to be part of a much larger, more sinister plot. What had started as an investigation into a string of brutal murders had now turned into a full-scale crisis, with political, military, and international ramifications. In a bold move to regain control of the narrative, the Iranian leadership decided to broadcast a public message to the Muslim world. The government had long held a reputation for secrecy, but the unfolding crisis forced them to take an unprecedented step, an open acknowledgement that something deeply troubling was happening within the country. On state-run television, the Iranian president addressed the nation, warning of a threat far greater than anyone could have anticipated. The speech was direct and alarming. There was an internal conspiracy, an operation that threatened not just Iran, but the entire region. The government made it clear that the murders of the clerics were not random. They were part of a much larger, more dangerous plan that involved manipulating global powers into war. However, despite this public acknowledgement, the government stopped, short of revealing the full extent of the conspiracy. They hinted at the false flag operation, but they did not provide details. Instead, the Iranian leadership focused on rallying national pride, urging the Muslim world to stand united in the face of external aggression. The message was clear: Iran was under attack from within, but also from the outside, and it was up to the people of the Muslim world to be vigilant. What Iran's leaders didn't say, however, was perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. The real masterminds behind the plot had not yet been revealed. The public warning was just the first step in a broader strategy to control the narrative. But even as the government acted to stave off panic, the true scope of the crisis remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting to surface in ways that would shake the region to its core. The Iranian government's decision to broadcast a public warning sent shockwaves not just through the country, but across the entire Muslim world. For the first time in decades, the Iranian leadership had acknowledged a grave internal crisis, one that was not just a political scandal, but a deep-seated, dangerous conspiracy that could threaten the stability of the region. The carefully worded speech, broadcast on every major network, did little to calm the growing sense of panic. Instead, it stirred up more questions than answers. Who were the true masterminds behind the killings? What were the clerics really involved in? And most crucially, Why did Iran's leaders choose to reveal such sensitive information at this moment? Within Iran, the response was immediate. Some factions within the government hailed the speech as a brave step toward transparency, while others saw it as a desperate attempt to maintain control over a rapidly disintegrating situation. The nation was divided. Among the general populace, confusion and fear began to spread like wildfire. Religious leaders, normally figures of calm and stability, were now viewed with suspicion. The clerics who had been killed were not just casualties in a political game. They were symbols of a much larger battle, one that was being fought behind closed doors, away from public view. As rumors swirled, many began to question the loyalty of those in power. Was there a faction within the Iranian leadership that had orchestrated the killings to cover up a failed military project? Or was the country really under the control of a shadowy, unseen force that had manipulated the situation from the very start? Across the Middle East, the speech was met with a mix of disbelief and alarm. Some saw it as a warning, a cry for help from a nation on the brink of collapse. Others feared that it was the first step in a larger strategy to mobilize regional forces in defense of Iran, leading to a military confrontation with the United States. International governments, especially the U.S., scrambled to interpret the Iranian message. The possibility of a false flag operation designed to provoke military retaliation from Washington was now more plausible than ever. As panic spread, many wondered how the Muslim world would respond. The speech was a call to arms, a plea for solidarity in the face of a perceived external threat. But behind this public rallying cry, there was a much darker undercurrent, an emerging realization that the true crisis, the one that could unravel the entire region, was still lurking in the shadows. The real players in this game were not yet known, and as the days passed, the uncertainty deepened. No one could predict what would come next, but one thing was certain. The situation in Iran was spiraling out of control, and its consequences would soon reach far beyond the borders of the Islamic Republic. As the Iranian government's broadcast sent ripples of uncertainty across the globe, foreign intelligence agencies, particularly from the United States, intensified their surveillance of Iran. For weeks, analysts had been combing through the decrypted files, trying to piece together the true scope of the conspiracy that had now enveloped the nation. The false flag operation outlined in the documents, designed to provoke the U.S. into striking Iran, had become a focal point for intelligence experts. They feared that this was not a mere plan but an imminent threat, one that could trigger a catastrophic conflict in the Middle East, potentially escalating into a global war. American intelligence agencies had long suspected that Iran's military ambitions were growing at an alarming rate. However, the revelation that a faction within the Iranian leadership had orchestrated such a sophisticated and manipulative operation to provoke war stunned even the most seasoned analysts. The possibility of a false flag operation was chilling. A staged attack, designed to appear as though it came from an external power, particularly the U.S., which would rally the Iranian public and justify military retaliation. It was a strategy that played directly into the volatile nature of international relations in the region, where a single misstep could ignite a full-scale war. The United States responded cautiously. While President Biden made statements condemning Iran's actions, the administration refrained from taking drastic steps, unsure of the full scale of the threat. Behind closed doors, officials debated their next move. Some urged a swift military response to send a clear message to Tehran that the U.S. would not tolerate such maneuvers. Others, however, worried that a hasty reaction could play into the hands of the Iranian government, turning the false flag operation into a self-fulfilling prophecy. The tension in Washington was palpable. There was a fear that one miscalculation could unleash forces that no one could control. Meanwhile, across the Middle East, countries that had long been wary of Iran's growing influence began to assess their own positions. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Gulf states were now faced with a dilemma. Should they align more closely with the U.S. to prevent Iranian expansion, or should they stay cautious, knowing that any provocation could trigger a conflict that would engulf the entire region? The possibility of a wider regional war hung in the air like a thick cloud, and the consequences of the wrong move were unimaginable. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Would Iran continue to push its agenda, risking everything in the pursuit of power? Or would the US respond, setting off a chain reaction that could change the course of history forever? As the global community continued to brace for what seemed like an inevitable conflict, tensions within Iran itself began to grow. While the public warning from the government had attempted to rally the nation, the response was far from unified. The Iranian leadership's acknowledgement of the conspiracy had raised more questions than it had answered. Inside the corridors of power, the struggle for control over the narrative intensified. Different factions within the government, some loyal to the hardline religious establishment, others to the more moderate political elites, sought to manipulate the crisis to their own advantage. Many in Iran's upper echelons feared that the public disclosure of such sensitive information could lead to a collapse of the nation's fragile political system. The revelation that a false flag operation was in the works could have disastrous consequences for the government, as it raised suspicions of widespread corruption and betrayal within the ranks of the country's leadership. Some senior military commanders were rumored to be plotting against the current regime, believing that the plan to provoke war was a reckless move that could endanger the very survival of the nation. These divisions would prove dangerous in the coming weeks as various factions began maneuvering to take control of the situation. Among the Iranian public, there was a deep sense of unease. While some rallied behind the government's call to defend the nation from external aggression, others grew skeptical. The clerics' deaths and the revelations surrounding them had shattered the trust in the leadership. Religious leaders, once pillars of authority and stability, were now seen by many as complicit in a dangerous game of geopolitical manipulation. The idea that some of the country's most respected figures had been involved in such an elaborate plan to provoke war left many questioning the true motivations of those in power. Amid this growing internal division, foreign actors watched Iran's fragile state with mounting concern. Saudi Arabia, long an adversary of Iran, saw an opportunity to exploit the situation. Rumors swirled that the kingdom was quietly providing support to factions within Iran's military, hoping to weaken the government and prevent it from carrying out the provocative actions outlined in the Clerics documents. Meanwhile, Israel continued to monitor Iran's missile programs, its intelligence agencies growing increasingly alarmed at the possibility of a full-scale military conflict erupting at any moment. Back in Washington, the situation became more urgent. Intelligence reports revealed that Iran's leadership was moving forward with its plans despite the growing international pressure. The United States was now caught in a precarious position. Any military strike could potentially play into Iran's hands, creating the very conditions the clerics had hoped for. The U.S. government had to tread carefully, knowing that the fate of not just the Middle East but possibly the world hung in the balance. In the midst of escalating tensions, a series of covert operations began to unfold that no one had anticipated. Behind the public rhetoric, both Iran and the United States were engaged in a delicate game of espionage and counterintelligence. The U.S. had placed its intelligence agencies on high alert, working to intercept any movements that could suggest Iran was about to execute the false flag operation. The stakes were higher than ever, and every move, no matter how small, was being scrutinized. For weeks, American operatives had been tracking movements within Iran's military, trying to discern whether the government would actually go through with the plan outlined in the Clerics documents. Satellite imagery showed a sudden increase in activity at military sites, including those tied to missile production and testing. The Iranian government had become aware of the intense surveillance, and the possibility of retaliation grew by the day. The fear in Washington was that any overt action could set off a chain reaction, confirming Iran's claims of aggression and allowing them to justify their premeditated strike. At the same time, the internal divisions within Iran continued to worsen. The government was not unified, and the factions within the leadership appeared to be at odds about how to handle the escalating situation. Hardline religious leaders, still loyal to the legacy of the clerics who had been killed, pushed for a more aggressive approach. They argued that now was the time for Iran to demonstrate its strength to the world. Meanwhile, moderates, who had always pushed for diplomacy and regional stability, quietly sought ways to undermine the more radical factions. Whispers of a coup began circulating within Iran's military circles, with some generals reportedly plotting to remove the hardline leadership in favor of a more pragmatic approach. The growing instability inside Iran caught the attention of neighboring countries. Saudi Arabia, having already been concerned about Iran's regional ambitions, saw the opportunity to strengthen its own alliances and increase its influence.